all the days to be a happy person, today's the day. Finally, a non-Persona scripted video. I am sick of it all. Time to talk about a game that I haven't even acknowledged since August of 2020. Resident Evil 3, the remake. It's no secret that I hate the Resident Evil 3 remake, and I made a video about how it was the worst Resident Evil game way back when times were much simpler. But that video was flawed, to say the least, and I probably should point out that most of what I'm going to talk about is mere theorizing, and none of this is confirmed by any means. But you know what? It's the 4th day of Christmas, damn it, and Santa wants what Santa wants. So here it is. Let's dive into what happened to Resident Evil 3. Also, quick little tidbit, this is actually taking place on the same day, I just realized this, on the same day that I released the What Happened to Doki Doki Literature Club video, which got 24,000 views if I remember correctly. It's probably one of my most popular videos, which is really fucking cool. So thank you guys for that, because that was awesome. And let's see if we can do the same thing with this video. I need to feed my family, guys, come on. To say the Resident Evil 3 remake was underwhelming says a lot about the games that were released both before and after it. Biohazard walked away with a little over 10 million copies sold, the Resident Evil 2 remake isn't far behind with 8.9 million copies, and the latest installment, Resident Evil Village, sold 4.8 million copies in its first 6 months of release. And then there's Resident Evil 3. Having fewer copies sold than games that were released prior is totally fine, albeit both Biohazard and RE2 had over double the copies sold. But to have fewer copies sold than the most recent installment of the fucking franchise is an issue. The Resident Evil 3 remake sold 4.6 million copies over its year-long tenure so far, which means that there's a 200,000 copy differential. So it's obvious that in comparison to its peers, Resident Evil 3 didn't do too hot sales-wise. But why was that? The game was bound to fail considering a multitude of factors. Let's take into consideration that the Resident Evil remakes, both 2 and 3, went into production around the same time, right after Biohazard was finished, according to the fandom wiki. Also, take into consideration that Village would then go into production just 6 months before Biohazard was set to release, and that would mean that Capcom had 3 Resident Evil games brewing together at the exact same time, which is not easy even for a AAA title company. Needless to say, Resident Evil 2's release in 2019 would make Resident Evil 3 a target for fans to both be excited and worried about. Would this game be as good as its more successful big brother, or would it fall flat due to the standards that have been set by said brother? It was the latter. Resident Evil 3 flopped in comparison to Resident Evil 2. The game, if completed for an S rank, was only an hour long. There weren't any extras or DLCs. Hell, Nemesis didn't even have a Tyrant style of gameplay besides the very beginning of the game. And on harder difficulties like Inferno, Nemesis is basically a cheat if you don't know how to use the deagle to disable him, because trust me, you're gonna have to disable him a lot. The Resident Evil 3 remake felt like the devs wanted to have a nice big game but didn't have the time and thus released what they finished. Or it could be something completely different and Capcom just didn't give a shit. A quick disclaimer before I discuss what I found on the ever-truthful website 4chan. These leaks aren't 100% confirmed to be Capcom's and might be fake for all we know. However, most of the dates and presentations line up with the events of development with the game, and this is as close as we're gonna get to what was going on in the production phase because Capcom hasn't publicly spoken about the development of RE3 at all. That being said, do take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. So the possible plans for RE3 have leaked a while ago, and while looking into them, I found some interesting stuff about what Capcom wanted to do when it came to production value. I also wanted to point out that most YouTubers have used this leak as a way of floating a rumor for another Resident Evil 3 remake release, which I think is bullshit, but I refuse to rain on anybody's parade. Resident Evil Resistance, god, when was the last time anybody mentioned that piece of shit we call a video game, was not only the worst multiplayer game ever created by a AAA title company. I mean, really, God? You couldn't have struck lightning or something to give them a sign to stop production? But Resistance was actually a problem with the single-player mode, apparently, and a lot was sacrificed in the Resident Evil 3 remake to make way for Resistance, which I assume Capcom thought would be a huge success. Capcom also knew that the game was way too short for being $60, yet went through with it anyway because fuck the fans, I guess. If you don't believe me, just look at the files yourself. I'll link them in the description below. Really, all of this to say that Resident Evil 3's remake lost out on content because of the multiplayer being put in the driver's seat. But that doesn't really mean much in reality. There's one more thing that made the boat sink very early on, and that also includes the multiplayer. The marketing. If there is one thing Capcom is good at, it's fucking up. Releasing Resident Evil 3 alongside Resident Evil Resistance was probably one of the worst ideas ever from a marketing standpoint for two reasons. The first is that Capcom made Resistance as a game that players from games like Dead by Daylight and Friday the 13th would quote-unquote enjoy, and didn't want to market it to Resident Evil fans as much, which is what caused its DOA status. The second is that Resident Evil 3 was marketed the most, which caused problems for both the remake and Resistance. I'm not kidding about the first point. One of the presentations Capcom did for the game said quote-unquote, multiplayer modes will primarily be an appeal point to another audience, Dead by Daylight, Friday the 13th, etc., that will have very small overlap with core RE fans. Capcom knew that they wanted a fan base different from that of Resident Evil, and yet they were off the mark by a long shot. And if you think this was an honest mistake, consider the fact that in order to play a Resistance, you have to purchase Resident Evil 3. So they wanted to market to an audience that wasn't, for the most part, Resident Evil fans, yet only made the game available for Resident Evil fans. Jesus, Harold Christ. Why does this matter to Resident Evil 3? Because Resistance was kind of the reason, besides being developed alongside two other games, Resident Evil 3 didn't get any extras or DLC. Capcom felt as though Resistance would be enough for Resident Evil fans, which it wasn't. Capcom also ended up teasing extra content for Resident Evil 3, which ended up being Resistance, and that was kind of a dick move. I'd love to talk more about the leaks, so if you guys want a video about me going into detail about the leaks, like the shit out of this video. I'm banking like 150 likes. Anyway, let's finish this video. The Resident Evil 3 remake was probably one of the worst Resident Evil games to ever be released in the last decade. I would put it up there with Operation Raccoon City. God, I hate Operation Raccoon City. But if there's one thing I could defend about this game, it's that if it were an isolated title, it would actually be a pretty damn good one. RE3 looks incredible. The gameplay is interesting and fun. The story isn't bad at all. If it weren't for that damn Resident Evil logo plastered on there with some super glue, the game would have been great. But knowing what we could have gotten brings this game down a peg. Actually, it brings it down a few pegs. Thank you for tuning in to Day 7 of Blue Stuff's 12 Days of Christmas. I hope you enjoyed this fascinating video. I plan to talk more about Resident Evil in the future, but for now, please be patient. Make sure to like the video, comment how fucking stupid Capcom is, and subscribe to turn on notifications so you can be in the loop for when I upload. Make sure to tune in for tomorrow's Day of Christmas. I can't wait to see what Santa has in store for me, although I have the feeling it's going to be a strategic FPS shooter. That's gonna be fun. Catch you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.